Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 4. So, as you can see from the title, we're carrying on our theme of relating with other people. These 3 lessons in a row, 2, 3, and 4, all deal with relating to people in different ways. How we should relate to them in general, the rationale behind why we should relate to them, and now culminating in Lesson 4, relating specifically to people in our immediate communities, whether that be family, work, school, church, etc. And so this is a kind of a unit, you could say, that we've been doing. We open with Lesson 1 on suffering, which is, I think, one of the biggest human struggles. What do we do with our suffering? And a lot of our suffering is related to other people and can be helped by other people. So that's the flow here for these 3 lessons. We're actually going to wrap up our study of literature in the first half of the quarter with this lesson. We don't have a lecture for Module 5 because we have a paper due then, your midterm paper, and I want you to be able to focus entirely on that paper for Module 5. So we'll wrap up our discussion of interacting with other people with this more specific focus, kind of a culminating focus for this little unit in this Lesson 4. And then after the midterm, we'll have 4 more lessons before the end of the quarter, and those will deal with more, you could say, larger, more existential kinds of issues, whereas these number of lectures here have been focused on relating with other people. We'll take you could say, a more external, more universal focus. And you'll see what I mean when you see the topics for the second half of the quarter. One quick note before we get started. This lesson actually has 3 parts, and so it's somewhat unique. And that's because your midterm paper is due at the end of the next module, Module 5. And so in addition to the 2 pieces of literature that we're actually going to study in Part 2 and Part 3 of this lesson, I also wanted to provide a lecture for you on tips, expectations, strategies for writing analytical papers about literature. I want you to be as prepared as possible for writing this paper. I don't want there to be any surprises. And so I've posted a lot of handouts and resources on Canvas to help with that. But if you pay attention to this Part 1 of this lecture, I think you'll have really great success on the paper. You'll be set up well, and you can always reach out to me with any questions. Now, there's no discussion board post requirement for this Part 1. There'll be the standard 2 lists of questions for the 2 pieces of literature, and those will be Parts 2 and Part 3, and you'll see all that on Canvas. This first part is just for your own edification to set you up for the paper. So enjoy. Here we go. In the very first lesson, I think, when I was going over the syllabus, how reading and writing are connected. So many studies, research, and personal experience show this, that writing about literature makes one a better reader, and doing a lot of reading makes one a better writer. You've been doing a lot of reading in this class. It's time to do some writing. So Module 5, there is no reading for Module 5, and your only assignment is to write your first of the 2 major papers that make up the majority of the grade for the class. And so the reason for that is, with this symbiotic relationship between reading and writing, rather than an exam or anything like that, is the best way to assess what you've learned from the course. And so we do a major paper at the midterm and a major paper at the end of the course. And even though it's mainly a reading course, a literature survey, since writing is the main way I'll assess you on that reading, we need to spend some time on it. I don't want to just turn you loose to write a major paper without going over my expectations and what I'm looking for. And one of my hopes is that these skills you learn in this lecture and then apply when you write your paper will be useful in other classes. Any class where you have to do, even if it's not a literature course, but any class where you have to do analytical type writing, where you have to look at something and explain how it works, or give an opinion about something and defend that opinion with evidence. Any writing assignment where you have to do that type of thing, these tips I'm about to go over will help you there. So you'll notice there are some handouts and some sample papers on Canvas. those are kind of your required reading, you could say, for this part of the lecture. So hopefully you reviewed those. I'm going to start by giving you my steps for writing, and then we'll look at the rubric from the assignment, and we'll finish out by looking at some examples from one of the sample papers. The one question you might have that I think we should answer before we dive in is, why are we talking about this now? Why are we talking about this at the start of Module 4 if the paper's not due till the end of Module 5? Well, my biggest tip I can give you for writing is to start early. And we'll talk about that on this next slide. And so if you need to start early to do well on the paper, then you need to have the overview of my expectations for the paper and my tips for writing early as well. So you'll probably be watching this ideally about 2 weeks before the paper is due. So that's why I want to go over it now, so you can use that 2 weeks or that period of time, whatever it is, to really prepare to write a very good paper. So here are my tips. The first one is start your paper well in advance of the due date. So like when I was an undergrad, I did the opposite of this, and it was a big mistake. I would wait until the night before the paper was due, and then I would start writing it like right before it was due, and then turn in this paper that I'd only done one draft of. If there's one thing I've learned about writing over the years, it's that you've got to do multiple drafts to get a good final product, and you need to give yourself time to do that. So start your paper well in advance of the due date so that you can write, point number 2, write multiple drafts. Now, there's another reason for giving yourself so much time, and that is in between each draft, you want to take some time off where you do other things and you don't think about your paper. And that's because writing is a very personal thing. We're very invested in our writing, and it can be hard to be critical of our own writing. And later on, we'll talk about the importance of having others read your writing, which is for that same reason. But right now, I'm trying to give you some tips for how to be a little more objective, a little more critical of your own writing. And one thing that happens when we write is we get caught up in our ideas, and we're very much in our head. And so you need to let it cool off after you do one draft. Take a little break in between drafts. Depending on how much time you give yourself, that might be a day or 2 days. If you give yourself 2 weeks and you do 3 or 4 drafts, you could probably take 2 or 3 days off in between each one, and that would really be ideal. I would recommend that if possible. And so write a draft. It's okay if the first draft is very rough, but get something down. Then take a day or 2 off where you go to work, or you do homework for other class, or you relax, you do something else. And then after you've had a break where you have not been thinking about the paper, get up early, cup of coffee, very fresh in your mind, or maybe it's at night when you're really fresh in your mind, whatever works for you. I'm a morning person, you might be an evening person. But when you're very thinking really clearly, read back through your paper, and you will notice all kinds of things you would not have noticed if you just read it as soon as you finished writing it. I'd also recommend reading it when you reread it out loud slowly. If you just read it in your head, you won't catch as many things as if you read it out loud. So read it out loud slowly, and you'll stop when there's punctuation, commas, and periods. So you'll hear if those are in the wrong spots. You'll hear things that don't make sense. That might make sense if you were reading it in your head, and you'll think, oh, I need to make this clear. This will be unclear to my reader. So go through after you've done that reading out loud and edit it and make it better and improve it and have a more polished second draft. And when you do that second draft, I have this tip in bold, underlined with asterisks here. Make the conclusion to your first draft the introduction to your second draft. I'm going to read that again slowly. Make the conclusion to your first draft the introduction to your second draft. Pause the lecture, think about that for a minute, let that marinate. What that means is When we write, we have to struggle through our ideas. We have an idea, but it's not finalized yet. It's not in its best form yet. And we have to kind of grapple with it, struggle with it, toil with it to get it to its best form or a better form. And sometimes the best way to struggle or toil with our ideas is through the act of writing. So we often figure out what we're really trying to say, the point we really want to make after we've written the entire first draft. That is so common. I can't tell you how many times I was grading student papers and I kept struggling with trying to understand the paper. And then I got all the way to the conclusion and I said, it makes so much sense now. You really, hit your stride at the end of the paper. You don't want that to be the case with analytical writing like this. You want the reader to know up front what your ideas are. You don't want them to be confused while they're reading. So maybe you literally copy and paste your conclusion to the top. That's a good strategy. Maybe you just kind of read your conclusion and then rework your intro. But either way, your ideas are going to be clearer after your first draft. So when you go to do that second draft, you want to rework the intro to make your ideas much clearer than they were the first go around. So after you do this second draft, it's probably going to be much more polished, and you're probably ready to have other people look at it. Maybe you want to do 3 drafts before that point. That's okay. There's some flexibility here as long as you're doing multiple drafts. But when you feel like you got it polished enough for other people to read it, have other people read it. There's a few routes you can go here. EWU has a wonderful writer center. Our writer center is incredibly unique because we have all writing professionals working there. A lot of writer centers at universities throughout the country are staffed by work study students who would be your peers, fellow undergrads. Everyone at EW's Writer Center has either their master's or even some of them have their PhD, and they all work in a field because the Writer Center is like a part-time job. So their primary job, they all work in a field that involves writing and publishing. So they're incredibly good writers. They're incredibly helpful. And they've got, virtual appointments during the pandemic. So make an appointment with the Writer Center. If you look on Canvas at our assignment sheet, you'll see I'll even give you extra credit for doing that. So that will help tremendously having someone from the Writer Center read it. You could also have friends, family, significant others, coworkers, roommates, whoever you can think of read it. I'd be happy to read it. If you want to email me or come to my Zoom office hours, I can look at your thesis statement and give you feedback on that, or I could even give you feedback on an entire draft if you want. I'd be happy to do that. So just, let me know. Email me or come to my Zoom office hours if you'd like to do that. But no matter which of those options you choose, and I recommend all of them, and I recommend the Writer Center as the best option, but have at least someone else, not just you, read one of your more polished drafts when you're a little farther along in the writing process. And this is because we have an audience when we write. Like, you're turning this paper in for this class, so I'm your audience. But you're going to have writing situations throughout your life, whether that's emails or assignments for other classes or whatever it is, writing for scholarships or to get into graduate school. Those applications, you're going to have writing situations where you have an audience. But we often, when we write, think of just ourselves, and we're like writing for ourselves. And the biggest, most important switch you can make when you're writing is to write for others, not yourself. To imagine your audience and what they'd be expecting, what they would be thinking of this. And so that's really hard to do. And that's why my tip right before this was to have other people read your paper. So you've got to imagine that audience. The best way to imagine that audience is to actually give yourself one, to take it to the Writer Center, to have a friend or family read it. And so after you have others read it, and you do another draft, maybe it's your third or fourth or fifth draft, get it really polished, read through it one last time, then you're ready to turn it into Canvas. So I don't have separate assignments for multiple drafts. The writing process is on you to take it upon yourself to go through these steps, but that's why we're doing this lecture now. Well, I'm giving you a couple of weeks to go through this process. So take these steps, do multiple drafts, and make that final product you turn into Canvas truly a final draft, a third, a fourth, or a fifth draft, not a first draft. That's my biggest tip for you. Okay, now I want to take a look at the actual rubric that's on the assignment. And this is a rubric, but it's longer than you'd probably think of as a rubric. So it's partly the criteria I'll use to evaluate you, which is a definition of a rubric, but it's also the steps you should go through when writing your paper. So you can think of this as kind of a checklist. And when you're doing your multiple drafts and you're going back and revising, you can look at this and kind of check them off. Print it out and check them off with a pen or whatever's easiest, but make sure you have these. So number one, make an argument about the text that is supported by thorough analysis of actual language from the text. So this is the overall, this is like a summary of the whole thing I'm wanting you to do. And there's two key components to the text, to the paper, sorry. You need to have a thesis, an original argument you're making, your opinion about what the text means. And for our class, I have questions on Canvas, so answering that question clearly and fully can be your argument. You can turn that into a thesis. And the second part is close reading. The best way to support an argument about literature is the actual language, not the plot, but the language of the literature itself. So as you go throughout the paper, quote from the story or the poem or whatever it is you're analyzing and explain how that language, those words, prove your idea from your thesis. So point number one here is the paper as a whole, the two main parts being the thesis and the close reading. We're now starting with point two. We're going to go through it more step by step. So two, begin with an introduction that contextualizes and introduces your text and argument. So the question here being, should the thesis be the first sentence in your intro? No. Start with some kind of general background that most people would be familiar with, and then kind of build a bridge to your specific text, and then conclude the intro with your final sentence in your intro being your thesis. If your thesis is your final sentence in your intro and you've got a little bit of background first, the reader will be prepared for your thesis, and it will also be the freshest thing in their mind when they read the rest of the paper. And I've got a couple of the handouts on Canvas outline the structure of the paper. So if you've looked at those, you'll be picking up on these things. Then at the end of your intro, like I said, offer a unique or creative thesis. So these questions build in complexity, going from the reading questions to the discussion board questions are a little more complex than those. And then these questions for the paper are more complex than the discussion board questions. So if you truly think this through and give a full answer, your idea will be fairly, creative. But most importantly, with step three here, end your intro with a clear statement of your thesis. Number four, provide clear claims or arguments at the start of each body paragraph. So your thesis will have supporting points, pieces of evidence that support it. You want to focus on just one of those in each body paragraph, then start a new paragraph when you're focusing on the next one, and state that idea in the first sentence of the body paragraph so that the reader knows what the paragraph is about before they read the rest of it. And each of those supporting claims should be an argument itself as well. We'll talk about that more when we get to the sample papers in a few minutes. Number five, develop your argument logically and clearly, supporting all claims with evidence. Close reading, thorough analysis of actual language from the text. So this is the close reading bullet point. So after you state your supporting argument in the first sentence of a body paragraph, you then maybe give some context, but pretty soon after that, quote from the literature, and then explain in your own words how that language from the literature proves the argument you made in the opening sentence of the body paragraph. Moving along here, these points more now kind of deal with the paper as a whole. So you want logical structure and organization throughout. You want the paper to flow well. Talking about the points in the order you talk about them in should make sense to the reader. Use effective grammar, spelling, punctuation, syntax, and other sentence level strategies. So when it comes to grammar, I'm not someone who counts commas or periods because I don't have the time for that, and it's important, but it's not that important. So it is important. So I always say my philosophy is if I can read the paper clearly and your ideas are clear, the grammar, the syntax is fine with me. You'll only lose points for this criterion if, your grammar and syntax is making it actually hard to understand what you're saying. Maintain a clear focus by connecting all your claims back to the central thesis. So those supporting points at the start of each body paragraph should relate to your overall thesis. Avoid plot summary. I'm familiar with these works. If you want to do a tiny bit of summary to kind of contextualize your quotes, that's fine, but you don't need hardly any plot summary. These are short papers, low word counts because I emphasize quality over quantity. So if you're jamming the paper full with plot summary, that's not going to go well. If you don't have analysis but you have summary, that's probably a failing paper. You have to be analyzing the language, the quotes from the literature. Finally, include a logical conclusion. People always ask me about the conclusion. The conclusion should be the shortest paragraph in the paper. It should be its own paragraph, but it can just be 2 or 3 sentences. You can kind of restate your thesis, but that can be kind of generic. It's a place to make connections, kind of tie up loose ends, tie everything together. And by that, I don't mean restate each point. I mean show the relationship between the points. But most of all, why is your topic important? Thinking about that idea of how at the end of each lesson we have learning questions. Here, you can think of that, the so what factor. Why is this important? Why does this matter? End with that. Okay, so now that we've looked at the rubric and all of the things, kind of the checklist you could say I'm expecting on your paper, I want to look at the main ones in more detail. And so these last few slides are going to go through one of the sample papers and look specifically at its thesis statement, its topic sentences, and its close reading. Thesis statements, topic sentences, close readings. Those are the 3 most important aspects of the paper from the rubric. And so I want to give you fully fleshed out examples that we can critique and see, is this a good example, why or why not, to help you figure out what to do in your own paper. So the thesis, obviously, as we just talked about, is the argument that guides the whole paper. The topic sentences are the little arguments, the supporting points that prove your thesis. And close reading is analysis of the language from the text that you use to prove your topic sentences and in turn prove your thesis. So we're going to go through those 3 really important aspects of the paper right now with these specific examples. Really quick note before we get started on the sample papers. These are meant to be examples. Example rather than sample papers might be a better name for them. Do not misread my posting of these example papers. Do not misread them as templates. It's not take this piece and kind of fill in the blank with your own ideas. These are, for the most part, pretty solid papers, certainly not perfect papers. In my opinion, there's no such thing as a perfect paper. But even so, these are not necessarily the best papers I've ever received. I think they're just examples that illustrate how to do a thesis statement, how to do topic sentences, how to do close reading. And so think of them more as kind of guides or examples, but not a plug and play, not a template to mimic really precisely, just kind of give you an idea of the type of sentences that lead to the clearest, most effective writing. So that's one note. Another note I want to make here before we look at the sample thesis is this paper is on the 1001 Nights, which is not a text we're studying in this class. It's from a different class I taught in the past. And this is chosen, I've chosen this in part intentionally, again, to illustrate the point I just made, that you don't want to mimic these papers precisely. You want to just kind of see them as models or examples. So a little bit later on, as we get kind of deeper into the close reading part, I'll give some background on the 1001 Nights in case you haven't read it. But with those two notes out of the way, let's look at this sample thesis statement. So I'm going to actually show you two sample thesis statements. Here's the first one. The 1001 Nights is the story of Scheherazade telling the king a different story every night to save the women in the kingdom. Is this a good thesis? Why or why not? Go ahead and pause the lecture, jot down some notes, and think about if you think this is a good thesis and why or why not. Ideally, you decided this was not a very good thesis, but what specifically is wrong with it? A number of things you could mention. I would say most importantly, it summarizes what happens in the text without taking a clear stance. So if I had asked you what is the unity of the 1001 Nights, this would actually be a good summary. It's very concise and gives a good overview in a succinct way. But that is not a thesis. A thesis needs to be an argument. It needs to take a clear stance and say, this is what the meaning of the text is. And that needs to be debatable. When we look at the great books, the great works of literature like we're studying in this class, and 1001 Nights would certainly be included among those, there's many ways to interpret them. And so there are no wrong thesis statements in this class. There are only well-supported and poorly supported ones. But this is not a thesis. This is not an argument. So it has to be your specific interpretation of the text that some other reader might disagree with, so that you have to defend it in the course of the paper through your supporting points and through your close reading. So now let's look at another example that hopefully might be better. And this one comes from the student paper. The 1001 Nights subverts the patriarchal standards of the day by exposing a woman's potential to be just as powerful, intelligent, and heroic as a man through the protagonist, Scheherazade. So again, pause. Is this a better thesis? Why or why not? It is definitely more effective, but why? Well, mainly it takes a clear stance. So there's clearly an argument here on what the meaning or the message of the text, in this case, the 1001 Nights, is. Some people might debate this stance. A thesis should make an argument. So one of the key words here is subverts. Some synonyms for subvert would be challenge or critique. So the 1001 Nights subverts the patriarchal standards of the day by doing such and such. By saying a text subverts or challenges or critiques something, you're clearly making an argument. You're saying this text itself takes a stance. Now, you don't have to argue that particular type of stance. Again, this is just an example. But this example shows how it's clear. This particular example is clearly an argument. From the previous example, which was more of a summary, we can see that the text is about patriarchy, because what the king is doing could only really happen in a patriarchy. So we know that the text is about patriarchy, a male-dominated society, but this is saying it subverts the patriarchal standards. It critiques or challenges the male-dominated standards of the day. Now, this is definitely a thesis because some people disagree. There are a lot of really negative, dehumanizing, objectifying portrayals of women in the 1001 Nights that very much go along with patriarchal standards. But this particular student happens to be arguing that despite those, overall the text subverts these standards because of the most important character, what she does. So certainly some people would disagree with this. That's what makes it an argument. One last note is you have the phrase, by exposing a woman's potential to be just as, so on and so forth. So that word by is really key as well, because the student also gives a rationale, a reason for their thesis. So it's not just the 1001 Nights subverts the patriarchal standards. That's an argument on its own, but there's no reasoning to support it. That word by becomes like a because statement or rationale. And then you have a list of the things Scheherazade does that are unique, that challenge the standards of the day. Powerful, intelligent, heroic. There you've got 3 clear supporting points outlined. Now, you don't have to outline your supporting points in your thesis. If you can, that's great, because that forecasts where the paper is going. You don't have to. This student was able to do that here, but you need to have a clear argument about the meaning of the text some readers might disagree with, and a reason why. Here's a few other don'ts, things you shouldn't do with thesis statements. And so I'm going to show you here like how you could have that same statement we just had, the 1001 Nights subverts patriarchal standards, but how you could kind of ruin a good thesis by adding things to it you don't need. So a lot of students like to say, I think that, I believe that, I feel that, in my opinion. So a thesis that says, I think that the 1001 Nights subverts patriarchal standards, it's an argument, but it sounds weak, even though it's a very good argument, because the student chose to think, start it with, I think that. Now, there are places to use the first person pronoun I in papers, and I'm not saying it needs to be absolutely excluded. But when you have a thesis, when it's an argument, when it truly is an argument, it will be clear to your reader that it's a thesis, especially if it's the last sentence in your intro. So you do not need to say, I think or I believe before it. If you just can't help yourself, if you feel like you need to say something like that, say I argue that, because then at least sounds more professional and doesn't sound as weak or passive, but it's still better to just state your argument like it's a fact. I know it's not a fact, I know it's your opinion, but you're going to prove it through the course of the paper by doing your close reading. So it's okay if you state it like a fact. Also, don't say I will or this paper will. So many papers I read are so close to a good thesis, but instead of just stating their argument, they say I will show how the 1001 Nights questions patriarchal standards. That's confusing. You've already written the paper. I know I haven't read that part yet, but you've already written the paper. So it just makes the sentence wordy and confusing. So again, just don't tell readers what you will do or are going to do. It's the same idea. Just tell them your argument. State your thesis like a fact. Okay, so that covers thesis statements. Now, if you remember, I said each paragraph should start with a topic sentence, and that topic sentence should make an argument. So let's look at a bad example again. The frame story repeatedly shows Scheherazade telling the king a different story each night. The frame story means there's a story within a story in the 1001 Nights. So there's this frame of Scheherazade and the king, and then there's little stories within that frame that she's telling him. So this tells you what's going on, and the paragraph might have to do with this part of the story, the frame narrative. But is it a good topic sentence? I don't think so. So why not? So pause, try to answer this. It summarizes the plot. Like I said before, you should state an argument, and you should connect that argument to your thesis. And that argument should be in the first paragraph or the first sentence of each paragraph. So I could just read the first sentence of each paragraph and know you make these 3 or 4 or 5 arguments in your 3, 4, or 5 or however many paragraphs you have, and be able to kind of outline it that way just by reading that part of it, the first sentence of each paragraph. So let's look at a better example. The frame narrative repeatedly shows Scheherazade exerting power over the king through her enchanting stories. So if you take a minute and look, the first 6 words of this sentence are exactly the same as the previous one, because I wanted to show you how easy it is to fall into the trap of saying to the reader what the paragraph is about without making an argument, because it is about Scheherazade telling the king stories. But what this sentence example does, if you haven't already answered that, is it makes an argument about what she's doing there. It shows the significance or importance of what she's doing there and the relevance of what she's doing there to the thesis. Remember, the thesis was that 1001 Nights subverts the patriarchal standards by showing Scheherazade as powerful, intelligent, and heroic. So this sentence says she's exerting power over the king when she does this thing. And so I already know that word power connects it to the thesis for me, because remember, the thesis is just one sentence before this. And so now I know this paragraph is about power. I know there's probably going to be another one on intelligence and probably another one on heroism. But it makes an argument. So again, some people might disagree. Some people might say the king is more powerful. So the student then has to prove this. And by proving this, they will in turn also prove their thesis. And another thing you don't want to do is just kind of state it like this paragraph is about power. Same thing with the thesis. You can't just state, I will do this. You've got to make that argument. Okay, so you've got the thesis. You've got the next sentence is the first sentence of the next paragraph, and it makes the first. So it's like the thesis is one big argument, and then there's like 3 or 4 little arguments that prove that thesis. So you've got the thesis, and then in the very next sentence, the first sentence of the next paragraph, you've got the first of the little arguments that prove that thesis. So you have to prove each of the little arguments to prove the thesis. So how do you prove each little argument? That's where close reading comes into play. So I'm going to read 2 sentences here from the student's paper that are later in that same paragraph. So they're about how Scheherazade shows power. And then I'll explain how they work. So the first sentence will be the quote. The second sentence will be the analysis of that quote. As each night turns to day, Scheherazade does not try to deceive the king. Instead, she offers him a choice. Tomorrow night, I shall tell you something even stranger, more wonderful, and more entertaining, if the king spares me and lets me live. So you've got just a little bit of context here, hardly at all, one short sentence to introduce the quote. The student sets the quote up. They don't just drop the quote in without any context, but the context is very brief. And then you've got a nice little quote here. And if you're not familiar with the story of the 1001 Nights, the king, after he catches his wife committing adultery, decides to marry a different woman every night and then murder her the next day and marry a new woman. And he believes he'll never have a wife be unfaithful this way, but he's killing all of the women in the kingdom. That's the problem. And so Scheherazade is part of the upper class. He's not going to go after her first, but she self-sacrificially, she's very beautiful. The king would love to marry her, so she agrees to marry him, even though she doesn't have to, and she's risking her life. But each night she tells him a story and then makes this promise. Tomorrow night I shall tell you something even stranger. And that kind of lures him into wanting to hear the next night so he doesn't kill her. By doing this repeatedly, and then you have all these little stories within the frame, she eventually, each story kind of has a moral about being good. She teaches him through the stories to be a good king, and they live together forever, happily ever after, and he doesn't kill anyone else. So that's the context I'm only giving you because it's not from this class. You may not have read it. So what does the student then in the next sentence say about this quote? Scheherazade exercises her power over the king in an overt manner that is enjoyed by the king. Unlike the more commonly seen portrayals of women covertly tricking or deceiving men and momentarily stealing their power, Scheherazade is empowered willingly by the king's encouragement to continue her stories. So what the student means here is you can see Scheherazade as being very powerful because the king wants to hear the next story. She's not tricking him or anything. She has him doing what she wants by him thinking she's giving him what he wants. And so that shows that she's more intelligent, more powerful than him. And so what's brilliant about these few sentences is they directly explain the quote. They don't move on to something else. So often students will have a great quote, but then quickly move on to something else, or, only have like one sentence explaining it. But here you have, a few sentences explaining this, and they link the quote to that topic sentence. So the close reading is effective because the author directly discusses what the quote says and explains how the language of the quote supports or proves the argument from the topic sentence of the paragraph. So, and this in turn proves the thesis. So the thesis of the paper is, the word patriarchy means male-dominated society. So the thesis is 1001 Nights challenges patriarchy because Scheherazade is powerful, intelligent, and heroic. This paragraph deals with power. So, the first sentence of this paragraph is just Scheherazade shows she's powerful by her power over the king. This quote explains it, and she says, the quote shows how Scheherazade is powerful over the king. So with that explanation, you have it complete. If power is one of the 3 points to proving the thesis about patriarchy, this analysis of this quote has now proven the point about power, and the writer can then conclude the paragraph and transition to talking about intelligence in the next paragraph, and in a similar way prove that point, and so on and so forth. So this is the structure for a literary analysis paper. Intro with thesis at the end, topic sentence at the start of each body paragraph, and then quotations with, most importantly, analysis of the quotations to explain how they prove the little arguments and in turn prove the main argument, all while making your connections clear throughout. So I hope that makes sense. Like I said, if you have any questions, contact me. To sum up, these are my final points. Like I said, don't treat the sample papers as templates. Treat them as models or examples. Use them to help guide you to writing your own original sentences and paragraphs. But, don't think of them as like templates or equations to fill in. And my very most important tip, like I said, start early and write multiple drafts. The paper we just looked at was very cohesive. It all flowed well. There's no way it flowed that well on the first reading. To make all of those connections so clear, the writer has got to do multiple drafts, go through multiple times, have other people read it, because there was probably someone at the Writer's Center or a friend or someone who read this paper and said, this connection is not clear here. I don't see how this paragraph connects to the original, to the thesis. And then the writer said, I need to mention intelligence more directly or power more directly, and then fixed it. So start early, write multiple drafts, have others read your writing. And again, I'm one of those others who's more than willing. So if you want to email me or come by my office, please do. No matter what, though, whether it's the first draft, the third draft, or the final draft, I really look forward to reading your papers whenever I get the chance.